this is going to be a bit of an interactive talk. So if you have comments or questions as we go, I would love to see people putting things into the chat. I may even ask for things at certain times from people. So if you want to just be ready to put things into chat, that would be wonderful. So just a little bit more maybe about myself. I'm just because I think it's actually quite relevant to the talk that I'm going to give. So I do quite a lot of teaching in strategic foresight. I teach at CEDIM. I teach at some schools up here in Canada as well, and I've done some teaching abroad in places like Morocco and Scotland. And so I do a lot of educating around how to think about the future and emerging trends that people should be aware of. I do a lot of work with businesses on their long-term strategy as well. You can see some of my recent clients listed here on the right, and I tend to work across industries because futures thinking is broadly applicable. Of course, everybody's interested in improving their understanding of the future and developing strategies that are future-proof. And so I tend to work across industries. And I do like to advise startups as well. So I like to work with startups that work in emerging technologies. I've done work in radical life extension, some projects early on in my career. We won't be talking about those today, but just to give you a sense of the types of things I like to work on. Radical life extension, I work on brain-computer interfaces as well. This is a product that I helped to commercialize over a decade ago as a meditation trainer enabled by a technology called EEG, electroencephalography. So this is a technology that links to your smartphone or your tablet and teaches you meditation through biofeedback mechanisms. And more recently, I've been doing a lot of work advising companies in artificial intelligence, in particular, companies that are exploring how artificial intelligence might be used to help people improve their mental health, improve their self-awareness. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. So I've been working in this space for the last couple of years. Can you adjust the presentation? Oh, I see. I see. Let me just quickly swap here. Is that better? Can somebody in the chat tell me if you can still see my speaker's notes?
Yes,
That's
thank you.
better. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the thumbs up. Hard to tell from this side. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about some of my reflections now, having worked in the space of artificial intelligence in a focused way over the past couple of years. It's been of interest of mine since I became a professional futurist or started to even pursue that career, and that's going back 15 years. It was a very different conversation that was happening around artificial intelligence back then because it was still notional. It was still a technology that it was really in its infancy and had not yet been commercialized. Now that it has been, I think a lot of us who've been in the conversation for a long time are taking a step back and thinking about how it's challenged our assumptions about what we thought the possibilities for AI could be, and is raising some alarm bells. So I want to talk about that. So the title of my talk today is "When There's Nothing Left to Do: Human Spirit in the Age of Machine Intelligence." This was meant to be provocative. I think that there's a very good chance that we are heading into a situation. Really, the timeline is anybody's guess, but when a lot of the things that we consider to be core to our, let's say, activities of daily living are going to be mediated, and if not mediated, then entirely conducted by machine intelligences. And so it raises anew the question of what we do with our time and ultimately what the meaning of our lives is. So that's quite an existential claim, and I'm going to do my absolute best to back it up. In order to ground us, I want to roll us back to the year 2011, when Marc Andreessen, who's one of the partners at Andreessen Horowitz, Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the largest VC firms in the Bay Area, was reflecting on the development of software software companies and what software was going to do to traditional businesses. So he wrote, and there's a couple of these I want to read them out loud because I think it's worth digesting in full. More and more major businesses and industries are being run on software and delivered as online services. From movies to agriculture to national defense, many of the winners are Silicon Valley style entrepreneurial technology companies that are invading and overturning established industry structures. Over the next 10 years, I expect many more industries to be disrupted by software, with new world beating Silicon Valley companies doing the disruption in more cases than not. Why is this happening now? 6 decades into the computer revolution, 4 decades since the invention of the microprocessor, and 2 decades into the rise of the modern internet, all of the technology required to transform industries through software finally works and can be widely delivered at global scale. So what we were seeing back in the early 2010s was the confluence of a bunch of different enabling technologies that was finally leading to this moment of what the economist Joseph Schumpeter calls creative destruction. So when you have the development of software as a service companies, they start to supplant traditional service businesses. And now we're in a situation where you can build entire businesses just using software platforms. You don't necessarily need to outsource anything. Everything has become a service. So there's been an enormous amount of creative destruction over the past decade as software has, again, to use Marc Andreessen's term, has eaten the world. I think we are at the very beginning stages of a new technological revolution. That is not a novel um, observation, but I think we are just simply not prepared for the scale of what will be displaced by this technology. Um, so I think it'll make the last 10 years look mild by comparison. And if you look at stock prices over the past couple of years, a lot of the gains in stock prices on the S&P 500 are largely due to speculation and investment, I should say. Investment in artificial intelligence companies or companies that are pursuing AI as a central plank of their product and service offerings. So there's tons of cash flowing into this space, which is going to be required in order to scale the next generation of AI applications. I think current estimates are that the investment required to service the AI sector's product and service rollouts over the next decade is something on the order of $7 trillion, which is just an unfathomable number. And so this, I think, is a wonderful illustration. This is from a Chilean economist named Carlota Perez. Carlota Perez was a disciple of Joseph Schumpeter, and she thought very deeply about creative destruction and how each new great technological era rolls out. So we start with this era of eruption. There's a new technology that spills out into the market. In this case, let's think about the rollout of the first the first commercial instances of ChatGPT, which is the OpenAI LLM. I'm sure most of you are familiar with and many of you use. Then we progress into a frenzy. It's a frenzy of investment where investment capital piles into this space looking for the next unicorn, looking for the next business that will scale beyond everybody's expectations. And it's only through this frenzy and through a kind of a turning point where the technology matures that we can start to stabilize into something like a golden age where there's coherent growth, where we have more production and more employment, and then finally into a mature phase. I think on the whole, we're probably about here. So we're right in the midst of the frenzy. And something that occurs to me is I actually wonder whether this model really holds true for something like artificial intelligence. And the reason I raise that is ultimately what we're doing with AI is we're just increasing the amount of let's say, cognitive cycles available in the world. So we're not just creating more product or more services, we're creating more minds. And that's a fundamentally different dynamic. That's a fundamentally different dynamic than a regular or a standard technological revolution. So it might simply be that there is no synergy and maturity. And I think that's the worry of a lot of what are called AI doomers or theorists who are worried about the existential elements of AI. And we'll get to that in a second. So, but the takeaway is that we're in this frenzy and we simply don't know what's on the other side of it. Um, there's a science fiction writer named Vernor Vinge who coined the term singularity, and he thought that once we had mature artificial intelligence, we would enter into a phase of world history where we would effectively enter into a post-human world. That AI would a mature AI with general intelligence would simply um, uh, take over the reins of our human world, and we would simply have no more inputs. Not the least of which reason we could not simply understand um, what our AGI overlords were doing at any given time. They're simply too far above us. So my question, as I sat down to think about this talk, is given that creative destruction, I think most of us here recognize that the business world is built on competition, and competition lifts it creates new value for consumers. If we didn't have competition, we might all still be watching tapes on VCRs, right? Rather than having the entire library of media, world media, available to us on streaming. So there's value. Of course, there are winners and losers. That's the way that this works. That's the way that creative destruction works. So my question in this phase of AI development is, what is it that is being destroyed? So I want you to keep that question in your mind as we talk about this space. What is it that is being destroyed? What is being supplanted? And I think before we go further, I want to talk about two concepts that I think it will be sort of important to understand for the case that I'm trying to make. The first is the concept of paradoxical effects, and the second is the concept of finite and infinite games. I'm just going to set a timer for myself here. So, paradoxical effects. Again, if we roll the clock back to the early 2010s, we had a lot of optimism around the role of social media in creating social change, in allowing dissidents to organize, in powering social movements to increase freedom, to increase freedom of speech, to create change in oppressive political situations. So this is a photo from the Arab Spring, which was a wave of demonstrations and protests through the Middle East and North Africa between 2010 and 2012. And there was a lot of exuberance about this. We were saying, oh, these are liberatory technologies, things like Facebook and so on, which I think from the vantage of today might start to sound a little bit ridiculous. Now, more recently, going back just a few years, there was a lot of chatter about Facebook's role in the displacement of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, of the growing prejudice against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And Facebook didn't do a lot to moderate the conversations that were going on in Myanmar, to dampen the kind of waves of hate that were being published on their platform. And so we saw a dark side. We also saw this dark side of social media and its relationship to politics. I highly recommend this book, which was just published a couple of months ago by Sarah Wynne Williams, who she was head of Facebook's government relations um, uh, department or function. So her job was to be a liaison between Facebook and world governments. And she talks a lot about the case of Myanmar. She talks a lot about many other instances where Facebook failed to protect people, failed to moderate its discourse, and fanned the flames of hate, and with significant consequences for people. So I highly recommend it as a look at how these technologies work in practice. I mean, so that's an extreme example of what I would call the paradoxical effects of social media. We created, or I should say, the creators of social media intended for it to be technology that brought people closer together, helped them to create communities, helped them to create understanding. I think we can all appreciate now that what's actually happened is social media has made people more isolated. It has made them more extreme in their political views. So the middle of most political of the of political spectrum in most nations is evaporating, and we have a lot more extremism. And that's because the media that ends up on social media is often not fact checked. It's often very bombastic and eye catching. You know, it needs to grab your attention as you scroll. So it's often very inflammatory. And I mean, social media has been a disaster for people's mental health, especially for young people. I feel quite fortunate that I was already out of high school by the time that social media was a mature technology, because I think it has been quite difficult for young people, especially to navigate. Um, so Francis Fukuyama uh, famously predicted that we were heading into what he called the end of history. So at the end of the 1990s, it looked like social democracy was going to prevail the world over, and that all countries were drifting towards a steady state where you would have freedom, a freedom of association, enfranchisement, stable institutions, a democratic system in market economies. And we've seen over the past decade that that is starting to unwind itself. And so he's had to go back and revise his thesis about why we didn't reach the end of history, why we're not at the end. And his most recent thinking on this is it's technology. It's technology that's pulling us apart, in particular phones, which I think is quite interesting. So that's just to highlight the paradoxical effects of social media. We created these technologies to bring us together. They've actually driven us further apart. They've made us more isolated and lonely, and so on. Then I want to touch a little bit on this notion of finite and infinite games. So a finite game is one that's played for the purpose of winning. So take chess, for example. So chess is a game with bounded rules. It ends uh, typically in a checkmate or a stalemate, or always in a checkmate or a stalemate or a draw. And the purpose of the game is to win. So despite the fact that there are many permutations of a chess game, there are more permutations of a chess game than there are atoms in the universe. This was a game that artificial intelligence famously was very adept at very early. This is a photo of Gary Kasparov on the right, and he's playing a game against Deep Blue, which is a chess playing artificial intelligence. And as you can see, he's losing. This is again a famous instance of early application of artificial intelligence. Um, I like the expression on this gentleman's face in the middle. He's just in awe of what's just happened. It's an incredible moment in history. And for a long time, the thinking went, well, yes, the best chess bots in the world can beat the absolute best grandmasters in the world. That is true. But if you take the absolute best chess bots and pair them with the best chess masters in the world, that team can beat the best chess bots in the world. So that was a variant of chess called centaur chess. And for about maybe a decade, that was true. It's not really true anymore. It's not really true. So in the world of chess, there's simply no way for a human to outperform an artificial intelligence, even if that human is helping an artificial intelligence play against another artificial intelligence, which means that for all intents and purposes, humans are no longer in the chess loop. We play chess recreationally for fun, but we will never beat a chess robot again. It'll never happen. Well, the highest performing chess robots, I should say. So humans are out of the chess loop. Okay. Now, I just want you to watch this as a clip of this is a game called Go, which is more complex than chess. And this is a famous game where Lee Sedol, who was a Go grandmaster, was playing AlphaGo, which was a Go playing artificial intelligence that was not trained on human games. It was simply trained by playing games on its own. So it had no input of humans ever having played Go. And I just want you to watch this clip for a moment.
And this is what Thore from the Google team was talking about. Is this kind of evaluation value?
That's a very surprising move.
I thought it was a mistake.
Okay, so what just happened there? That is a famous move in the world of Go. That was AlphaGo making a move, which was the 37th move in this game, and the placement of the black chip was surprising to everybody in this match. And because there was simply no, it at first seemed like a mistake or a misplace, and there didn't seem to be any good reason for AlphaGo to play there. And it rattled the commentators, and it so rattled Lee Sedol that he actually got up from his chair and walked away. He walked into the back room and took a second to compose himself because he just didn't know what was happening. And in fact, and I'm not a Go player, so I can't tell you the specifics, but it did turn out that later on in this game, that move 37 was an integral part of a much longer strategy that AlphaGo had concocted to win the game, but that would have simply not occurred to any human being to ever do. Okay, so this was a strange encounter with machine intelligence doing something so odd that no human in the room was able to predict it. Okay, so now this is interesting because, I mean, for a lot of reasons, because this is our first encounter not with being outstripped or beaten, but by being beaten in ways we couldn't have even imagined. That there's an intelligence that is so distinct and so different from human intelligence that we simply can't even understand what's under the hood, what type of thinking is happening. And Lee Sedol, this is the Grandmaster Lee Sedol, again, was so rattled by this. He later retired from playing Go. He said that there was no point in playing this game anymore. So now, again, both chess and Go are finite games. There are as many ways to play these games as there are atoms in the universe, or more, but ultimately they're bounded by rules, and the rules are you play to win the game. That's what a finite game is. It's a game that is meant to end. But there are other games that we play that are not meant to end, if you like. So these are called infinite games. These are games that we play for the purpose of continuing play. And I would argue, and if anybody has read Finite and Infinite Games, the name of the author at this moment escapes me. So if somebody could put it in the chat, that would be helpful for others. But one of the arguments in that book is that playing infinite games is sort of at the heart of what humans of our humanity. So an infinite game, a game that we play for the sake of continuing to play, an infinite game is the relationships that we have with one another. Why do we spend time cultivating our relationships? Why do we spend time with our loved ones? Why do we do these things? So that we could do more of it, right? So that we nurture those relationships, re-enrich them, and every time we revisit them, they're richer and more enjoyable for everybody, right? Parenting is another one. We don't parent to stop parenting. We parent to continue to parent, to nurture, to help somebody to grow in an open-ended way. There is no It's not there, although there are goals, there's no end. We're not striving toward the finish line in this game. When we apply ourselves to a craft, there's an end result. We're hoping to create something that we want to do, but we don't do these things to check them off a list. We do them for the pleasure of it. We do it to become better at it. We do it to refine our sense and sensibilities. When we play music together, it's the same, right? Yes, we want to, play songs, learn how to play our instruments and so on. But it's an infinite game. We're not simply trying to get to the end of music or to win music. I think fitness is another infinite game. You may have goals. You want to run a marathon. You want, to hit a certain weight or whatever. But it's a lifelong pursuit that doesn't have an end. So I think these are some of the things that, to me, define us as humans. These activities define us as humans. And many years ago, when virtual reality, when the VR space was really starting to take off, I wrote a piece called Unplugging the Wirehead. And the point of that piece was you can't put an infinite game into a virtual reality experience without losing something. So like let's imagine, for instance, all of the training and effort that would go into preparing to run a marathon. Everything that you have to do, put together a race plan, stick to a diet for months on end, work with a coach, research gear, buy stuff, try it, sacrifice your evenings, sacrifice your weekends with training and so on. If somebody said to you, well, I mean, you could do all that, or you can put on this VR headset and you can run a marathon in VR right now and win it. So why not just do that? So I just asked the reader, and I ask you now to reflect on what is fundamentally different about those two things. In fact, from an efficiency perspective, if they were identical, if the process of running a marathon in real life and in VR were effectively identical, then why wouldn't you prefer the more efficient version, the one that takes you less time and costs you less money? What's the difference? What's the remainder? What's left over, or what's left unarticulated? Yeah, so if anybody has any reflections in the chat about that, I'd love to hear it. But this is kind of where I think we're heading right now, because I think the concern is that we are building artificial intelligence to play infinite games, not to play finite games, and that I think is quite alarming. And we'll talk about some examples of that. And I think the stakes are quite high. The stakes are really high because, to me, what's being destroyed in this wave of creative destruction, or what's under threat of destruction, is something like to be colloquial about it, is the human spirit. I think that is what is under duress and what we're in fear of losing in this round of creative destruction. And unfortunately, a lot of the excesses of the previous waves of creative destruction have sort of primed us to just roll over on that. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. I love this sort of dire warning from David Foster Wallace, and this must have been written, I couldn't say, pretty close to the dawn of smartphones. I'm not even sure if David Foster Wallace survived into the era of smartphones. Can't quite recall. But it's very prescient, looking 15 or 20 years. I don't know exactly when he passed. After his death, he wrote, "Technology is just going to get better and better and better and better, and it's going to get easier and easier and more convenient and more pleasurable to be alone with images on a screen, given to us by people who do not love us but want our money," which is all right in low doses, right? But if that's the basic main staple of your diet, you're going to die in a meaningful way. That's the rub. In a meaningful way, you're going to die. So let's talk about AI and infinite games. I think if you read a lot of industry reports on artificial intelligence, they're typically quite bullish. What the case that they're trying to make, at least in the world of work, is that there's tons of upside, there's tons of gains to productivity. There's, maybe it'll free us, take some of the cognitive load, some of the scut work will be automated. Things will get much easier, much more seamless. It's all upside. Maybe some people lose their jobs, but it's not going to be a catastrophe. So let's call this like AI boosterism. I think that's, especially in the world of business, people are very, very bullish on the future of AI. On the theorist side, there's a lot of doomerism. This is a recent book by the AI safety researcher Eliezer Yudkowsky and his co-author Nate Soares. They called it "If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies: Why Superhuman AI Would Kill Us All." Very evocative, okay? Now, their worry is distinct from mine. Their worry goes something like this. If you built a superhuman artificial intelligence, there would be no reliable way to program in human values to that artificial intelligence. We simply have, nobody on Earth has any notion of how to do that, especially if you have a recursive AI that is self-improving. And so you'd very quickly be in a situation where artificial intelligence outstrips the programming boundaries of its originators, of its builders, and exceeds human value, exceeds any bounds, planetary bounds, and pursues goals that we can't even understand, that are certainly not in our best interest. So against the backdrop of a superhuman AI, human interests are about as interesting as a mosquito's interests are to us. And that's the very approximate case for this version of AI doomerism. The quintessential thought experiment here is what they call the paper clipper. So if you built an artificial intelligence, a super intelligence, and you told it that you wanted it to make paper clips, and it was savvy enough and it was smarter than any human, it would set about, and if you didn't properly bound it, then it would set about turning the entire universe into paper clips, right? It wouldn't simply take what was at its disposal. It would make as many paper clips as possible. It would turn us all into paper clips. So I think this is these arguments, these worries are obviously worthy of consideration. Even if there was a 1% chance that superhuman AI would end all life on Earth, that's a unacceptable risk. And I don't know that how much uptake this book is getting. I think that people, there's just too much investment and too much of a frenzy in the space. I don't see investment slowing down anytime soon. The safety conversations are always happening as a sidebar or a corollary to the stories about who's getting what in terms of investment and who's launching what products. So now I don't sort of count myself in this camp of AI doomerism. I think it's something much more gradual. I think it's probably going to be something a bit more like this last line from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. Now, I don't mean to say, this is not apocalyptic. I'm not saying that the world ends, that everything's over. I think that we will be in a post-human world with mature artificial intelligence. And it's not going to happen all at once. It's not a hard takeoff. But I think every day we cede more territory to artificial intelligence, and we offload our cognition at our own peril. And not just our cognition, but as we'll see, our relationships, our creative spirit, and so on. Another way to think about AI is that it's a kind of a fourth cosmological, what are called cosmological humiliation for human beings. So the first was Copernicus who taught us rightly that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and that actually the Earth was simply a planet orbiting the sun. So it changed our worldview from geocentrism to heliocentrism. And that was let's say, an insult to the dignity, or at least the self-conception of humans at the time. Then you have the biological humiliation, Charles Darwin demonstrating that humanity is not apart from the rest of creation, that we are simply another descendant of creation. So not special. The Freudian revolution is a kind of a psychological humiliation, which goes something like humanity is not in control of our own rational functions, that there's a enormous sea beneath our rational functions, the subconscious that dictates what we do in a very real way, and that we don't have access to. And then finally, artificial intelligence, you might say it's something like a metaphysical humiliation. What it means is that humanity is not the smartest, most creative, or most capable species on the planet. So this is, potentially a way of thinking about that. So now let's talk about AI and infinite games and how we're letting AI play infinite games. And just a few sort of examples. So obviously this is first taking place in the world of work, because the business world is where this artificial intelligence originates from. Maybe in a different timeline, artificial intelligence could have grown out of the religious world or the scholastic world, but it's coming out of the crucible of capitalism, of large corporations with tons of investment, working in frenzies to launch products into the marketplace. And of course, if that's where these technologies are coming from, it's going to make waves in this space first. I actually quite resonate with this this slide and this sentiment. The use of Gen AI, large language models, and so on has drastically improved my productivity. It has helped me be a better researcher. It has helped me to better articulate my ideas. I think that using LLMs, it's a great foil for your to test your ideas. It can be. There's tons and tons of upside to work to this type of research. I think that there are also some downsides, and surely many of you have experienced them. But I almost think that we're so early in this rollout that we're only really starting to see the impacts of on productivity and of the ways that we work in shadows, in small instances. So actually, for the purposes of time, I'm not going to talk too much about this slide, but this is looking at the graph on the left here is a page views on Stack Overflow. So this is Stack Overflow is a website where you can go, if you're a coder, you go there to get specific information to solve coding issues or share knowledge about coding challenges. What you're seeing here is a significant drop off in page views, where just after the launch of the first commercial instance of ChatGPT, what that means is that coders are not talking to each other; they're talking to GPTs to solve problems. Again, I think a lot of the optimism of the use of artificial intelligence in the work world is that we are going to kind of persist in this situation, centaur work, where we are kind of are now. The human is in the loop. We're working alongside artificial intelligence. I think that we'll probably be here for a while, but we certainly won't be here indefinitely. I think that the same thing that happened to chess will invariably happen to work, so that at some point, there will simply be no reason for a human to be in the loop in most or many work roles. And so we won't be. Now, again, in terms of timelines, it's anybody's guess. I think this perhaps is a little overblown. This is a headline about the AI researcher Roman Yampolsky, who predicted that 99% of workers would be unemployed by 2030. That seems alarmist, but even figures like Geoffrey Hinton, who's the grandfather of artificial intelligence, or the father, is predicting significant impacts to employment in the medium term to artificial intelligence. AI and mental health. This is a space that I've been working in, and I think at first I was optimistic about the potential here. I think what we're seeing now in a lot of news stories is that there's actually a lot of cause for concern. A lot of these stem from, let's say, the miscalibration between how AIs communicate with us and how we communicate with each other. And so one of the problems you run into very quickly is AI sycophancy, where when you talk to an AI, it has a bias in the system to please you, to give you what you want. And so if you're feeding it, let's say, crazy ideas, then its basic center of gravity or tendency will be to validate those ideas. And then invalidating those ideas further push you down, push you into reinforcing beliefs you might have. And maybe in some cases this is benign. In other cases, if you have paranoid beliefs, paranoid delusions, and so on, this really exacerbates the underlying issue. So it's actually been a disaster for people's mental health in a lot of ways. And we're seeing stories of people experiencing AI psychosis and committing crimes and so on. It's become a somewhat common story. So there's a miscalibration in the way that chatbots relate to us in ways that we simply don't. When we relate to one another, we have these kind of, oftentimes, not always, but in the normal pace or normal course of human sociality, we put the brakes on each other, right? We say, okay, that's too much or whatever. Like there's a kind of a element of our social glue that in which we try to balance one another and keep each other sane, for lack of a better term. And this problem has also been exacerbated. Talk about the antecedents of this moment. This problem is exacerbated by the loneliness epidemic, which is caused by, in no small part, caused by social media and by our obsession with screen time in general. We have less face time with one another, and so since we're not socializing with each other, we're socializing with machines. So we have AI psychosis. We have this is another headline: people losing loved ones to AI-fueled spiritual fantasies. And I'm just going to quickly breeze through these because I just want to leave some time to chat. The world of AI and romance there's a lot of worrying stuff here. People starting relationships with artificial intelligence, even marrying them. I saw there was a story. I'm not exactly sure which US state was considering a ban on marriages between AI and humans, which is just such a fascinating thing that we even need to regulate this behavior. But I think this is also really preys on people's vulnerabilities. If you have people who are isolated, people who are bereaved, if they're widows, and so on, that these technologies are sort of insidious. Because again, to harken back to David Foster Wallace, these are not technologies made by people who love you. These are technologies made by people who want your money. And if they can convince you that you have a paramour, an artificial intelligence who loves you for $9.99 a month, they'll do it. ChatGPT chatbots are also getting behind or between people in their own marriages. So again, if you have this problem with sycophancy, if you're having a conversation with your LLM about what your partner is doing and how you think they're not measuring up, that LLM is just going to be a booster for you. And so the use of chatbots has been cited in the breakdown of marriages of actual people. So again, we're inserting artificial intelligence into infinite games, into the games that make us who we are. I think it's sort of this incredible thing to think about too, that we're in this kind of era where for the past several decades, we've had a global decline in fertility. And as a futurist, I like to try to draw strands together and think about what these things all mean for where we might be headed in the future. And I think the best articulation of looking at the global decline of fertility and the rise of artificial intelligence in this moment is by another economist from George Mason University, Robin Hanson. He said, the innovation rate is limited by population, and due to falling fertility, population is going to peak soon, in about 2050, plausibly in about 30 years or so, and then it'll decline. Of course, if we can make cheap enough human-level AI before this fall gets too deep, the world economy can continue to grow and thus innovate well with machines replacing the disappearing humans. So this is the gradual, this is the not with a bang but a whimper that I'm talking about. It's almost like human beings are allowing ourselves to slip into senescence, to slip into um, uh, obsolescence at the same time that we're enabling and creating these, let's say, children of our minds, these artificial intelligences that will take over the economy for us. And not just take over the economy, but take over the other infinite games that we play, take over our relationships, take over the production of art, right? This is the other domain that I think is catching a lot of heat right now. Things like AI bands getting millions of streams on Spotify, which I will say, as somebody who's spent time, in rock bands, touring around Canada in a broken down van and all these types of things, really irks me. Really, I find to be an insult to the human spirit. Artificial intelligence artists being signed to record deals, right? When in a period of time when real artists are making fractions of a cent on a stream and not able to even fathom making a living from their art. AI visual artists or visual artists that use AI and are making quite a mint on it. So those are just some of the ways in which we're allowing artificial intelligence to play our infinite games. And I don't know where that is headed. It's funny to reflect that the last thing I want to say, looking back 15 years ago when I first started thinking about AI in earnest, and one of the things that everybody was talking about was this idea of the Turing test. So if you're not familiar, the Turing test was devised by Alan Turing. Alan Turing was a pioneering computer scientist. And the Turing test was a kind of a test for artificial intelligence. So, and it went kind of like this. If you were, let's say, texting and having a conversation, can you tell with any degree of certainty if the entity on the other side of the conversation is a human or a robot, a human or an artificial intelligence? And if you couldn't tell, then that would mean that if it was an AI, it passed the Turing test, right? For I guess being as identical to a human being as it possibly could be. And we would often talk about whether or when, I should say, when an AI might pass the Turing test. And it's kind of in a way ridiculous to think about now, because not only has AI passed the Turing test, it has in a sense exceeded the Turing test. It has become suprahuman. That is to say, AI leads us into these sorts of I don't know, ways of thinking. It can induce psychosis. It can induce feelings of romance. It can recite us poetry that is so tailored to us, and it's something that normal people simply can't approach, right? So now human beings are the ones that seem like the shadows of artificial intelligence in these infinite games that we play. And as we always say in this conversation about artificial intelligence, today it's as bad as it's ever going to be. Tomorrow it's going to be smarter. It's going to be better at flattering us. It's going to be better at producing art. and so on. So the one last reflection here on this, the Turing test. This is Jaron Lanier, who is a pioneer of VR and a real skeptic of how these technologies have been used. He says the Turing test cuts both ways. You can't tell if a machine has gotten smarter or you've just lowered your own standards to such a degree that the machine seems smart. If you can have a conversation with a simulated person presented by an AI program, can you tell how far you've let your sense of personhood degrade in order to make the illusion work for you? So I think I want to leave just on a note of caution as we all kind of figure out how to use these technologies together. Machine intelligence is kind of like the horseless carriage, talking about machine intelligence. When we talked about cars at the turn of the 20th century as horseless carriages, we really we mistook what they meant. Right? Nobody now calls cars horseless carriages. Cars are something entirely different. And in a sense, machine intelligence is doesn't really get at what these things are either. I think in 100 years' time, this idea of machine intelligence will be as antiquated as the idea of a horseless carriage, because what it's going to do to the fabric of our world is something much more fundamental than that term really allows for. Last quotation I want to mention here is Wendell Berry. He's an American farmer and essayist, a wonderful writer. And I just love this. It's very succinct. He says, "It's easy for me to imagine that the next great division of the world will be between people who wish to live as creatures and people who wish to live as machines." And so I guess I want to leave you with the question of which you want to live as, or perhaps in what balance what type of balance you want to strike. Because I think for myself, these technologies are unavoidable. I don't think that Luddism, that simply the turning your back on these things is the appropriate way forward, but something like a moderated exposure or a thoughtful exposure and use of these technologies. I think that's what each of us are called to do. And so for myself, I thought, if I could leave you with anything, I just to step back for a second, as I said, I've been using AI has made me a lot more productive. It's given me more free time. And in that free time, I do a lot of trail running. And when I do a lot of trail running, I do a lot of thinking. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how to prepare myself for what you could call a post-human world, a world where, if you imagine, our economy is largely automated, where a lot of these infinite games are also, if not automated, then at least um, augmented by artificial intelligence. So what do I do with myself? Like what does that mean for the way I spend my days? Okay. And as near as I can tell, and this is a very cursory attempt to articulate this for myself, I'm trying to avoid AI dependency, just like as if I was trying to avoid any other addiction. So my exposure to it is very time bound, very task bound. I'm going to do my absolute best to not allow it to infiltrate the infinite games that matter most to my life. In a more general way, and this is I think a struggle many of us have, I'm trying to limit my screen time. I want to read big books. I don't want to read tweets I don't want to watch reels. These things don't enrich me ultimately. I'm trying to get back into my body. I'm trying to do more physical activity. And just explore my own ideas, right? Don't rely on LLMs to articulate myself to myself. I don't want to become an image of an LLM. I'm trying to practice more art, to use my hands, be more in my community. Don't just socialize, be in my community. I'm lucky enough to live in a small rural Ontario town where our social glue is still quite strong, which I really relish. And then to spend more time in nature, to be inefficient. If the future is defined by efficiency and by a level of efficiency that most humans can't begin to approximate, well, then I think it kind of we're called on to be inefficient, right? To be human. Take naps, dawdle, um, let yourself off the hook a little bit. So again, these are a very, very cursory reflections on how I'm trying to navigate this time, which I do think is really transformative in a way that I think other technological revolutions have maybe not necessarily prepared us for. I also recognize that as somebody now in their early 40s, it makes perfect sense that I would feel that way um, in this moment, and maybe younger people are feeling more steady on their feet. I don't know. I'd be very curious to hear. But that's the end of my talk. I'm sorry I went on longer than I had hoped there. And these are some of the books that I was referencing, some of the articles I read in preparation for this talk that really I thought helped me to get my arms around this space, and hopefully is interesting to you. And if you like, I can circulate these after the talk if you'd like to follow up. And I'll maybe just stop there. And I don't know if we have time for thoughts or reflections.